I was thinking the other day about journalism and what's happened to it. And I realized that the people now listen more to comedians and businessmen than politicians and newscasters. And if you think about it, that's largely true. There are, the CEO of JP Morgan probably has more legitimate YouTube video views or online video views than Joe Biden, legitimately. If you think about comedians, Chris Rock probably has, over his lifetime, more views of his content than Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, despite the fact that both of them have been in their professions, politics and comedy, by the way, well, for decades, for almost the same amount of time. And to be blunt with you, it really does seem as if Chris Rock is a more intelligent politician. If you listen to his earlier work, or even say someone like Dave Chappelle, who in recent years has become more political. If you listen to Chris Rock's older issues, what made him so compelling wasn't just relationships, his commentary on relationships, it was politics. He's got a lot of commentary on police, a lot of commentary on gun control and racism. All the purview, part of the purview of what most people would consider politics. And what's difficult to remember as an American in the year 2021, as our politicians have degraded in quality, is that it wasn't always this way. Most people remember listening to JFK, who commanded the world's attention, not just his own country's attention. And we'll get to Eisenhower in a moment, but let's continue on JFK. It wasn't just the fact that JFK was a gifted speaker that made him so compelling. Malcolm X is an even better speaker, but he's not going to get the same number of views of his content than JFK. And you have to remember that part of the reason is that JFK represented idealism, and he was able to get it done. In many cases, right? You've got the space program, you have a lot of programs that were effective, perhaps too effective. And today, when you listen to a politician speak, they're sort of putting together buzzwords. If you're a Democrat, you're going to support the unions, so you're going to have to say something about the unions. If you're a Republican, you're probably going to talk about excessive regulations, and so on and so forth. And remember that, in the old days, there wasn't much entertainment, right? The politicians were the ones being listened to in the public square, literally. And to the extent there was competing entertainment, it was happening under the watch and aegis of those same politicians over at the Coliseum. And a lot of people want to say that, well, as time has continued and there's now more competition for eyeballs and ears with the podcasts, that the reason politicians have failed to keep up is because there's just too much competition. Teachers make the same argument as well. They say that education is failing because students no longer respect their teachers. And part of that has to do with television content. And everyone wants to sort of play the blame game. But what's really happened is that context has disappeared from journalism, as well as integrity. And if you listen to Eisenhower, if you listen to any of his speeches, he clearly wrote at least some of them. He wasn't just reading from a teleprompter. He wasn't just, repeating words like an actor reading somebody else's speech. So, when you listen to Eisenhower, there's a sense of authenticity. And that's what made him so compelling, is the fact that when he would travel to a small town in Vermont, his advisors would tell him about the history of the place. And he would sort of riff on that history. And he was able to do so in a way that was so sincere that he was compelling because he was sincere and honest. So some people want to say, and by the way, he was sincere and honest in a way that provided a value system that people wanted to look up to and therefore emulate. And so it's no surprise that today, it's not a coincidence, that the countries that he helped build with George Marshall, Germany and Japan primarily, are now more successful than the United States. Not so much Singapore, but still. Singapore had to find its own way after Vietnam and so on and so forth. And of course, with next door, what was happening in Indonesia, it's remarkable what Singapore has done. And that goes back to the fact that it's had great politicians, Lee Kuan Yew, who are comparable to Eisenhower. And this country no longer has an Eisenhower, probably won't in my lifetime again. And it's never had, and it never will have a Lee Kuan Yew. And that has consequences, because to the extent that business and comedians have taken over the political sphere, it shouldn't surprise anyone that politicians are now basically part advertising executives. There was a lot of hubbub, a lot of commentary about the former president's daughter supporting a corporation that was maligned in the media. Perhaps unfairly, I really don't know. And people said this was a conflict of interest. Well, turns out if you went online with the incoming president, if you went online and you tried to look at coverage of the inauguration, there was in fact advertising as well. But it probably wasn't so direct. I don't know, it's so hard to figure out, to follow the money these days, but there were definitely mentions of brand names, specifically, in multiple instances. So everyone is if everyone, regardless of the party, is essentially involved in advertising, what's happened? And we just talked about one reason, right? We talked about integrity, we talked about honesty, and so on. You're not going to see the Chinese premier advertising anything when he speaks, at least not now. One of the reasons that you have such a plain sort of dress is in fact because the communists were trying to oppose what they considered to be the decadence of the West, which included the same joke that we've heard about politicians here, that they would look like NASCAR drivers in terms of their uniform if they had to disclose who was really paying them to speak. In other words, they would have corporate logos all over their body and their suits. And if you look at the clothing of essentially the anti-West politicians, you'll notice it's completely different. It's quite plain. And in Iran, that's manifested itself in religion. In China, that's also manifested itself in simply having a less decadent style of, I suppose you could say, marketing or advertising. And that's allowed them to focus on content for now. But you can see how censorship helps if you are going to try a different path. And you don't have to compete. And the problem here is that so many people, especially Americans, are going to blame the internet, they're going to blame the changing medium for the decline of journalism and politicians. Those two things go together. But what's really happened is that our politicians have become less compelling because they've become less honest and less interesting and, quite frankly, less intelligent. And when you put all these things together, you have to remember once again that newscasters were listened to in this country. Dan Rather had more content views, perhaps at one point, than Richard Nixon. Edward Murrow also probably at one point had a similar view count than top politicians in foreign countries. Mary Mapes was also involved. And of course, Mary Mapes was developed by Dan Rather. So there's a sense that within journalism, it's not only lost talent to the financial sector and Hollywood, because we now listen more to Hollywood and business CEOs than we do politicians. There's not only a sense that the journalism sector is unable to attract talent, there's an idea that they fail to develop talent themselves. And so Mary Mapes has no successor. Dan Rather had one, but not Mary Mapes. You've got Edward Murrow. There isn't really anybody out there today that is similar. So there's an idea that journalism itself is quite fragile. And the reason for that is because it's oftentimes dependent on philanthropy. And so in San Francisco, about 1 hour from where I am now, there was a famous independent journalism magazine called The Argonaut, published by Hinkle. And it was independent journalism. It busted stories that no one else was covering, including CIA activity on college campuses. And you'll notice that eventually, right, these independent magazines or publications publish a story, and then the major outlets catch up, in part because they have to, otherwise they would lose credibility. And you start to see, once again, there isn't really anything on the same level as the Argonaut today. And one of the reasons was because the Argonaut didn't necessarily rely on advertising as much as it did a philanthropist. And when that philanthropist dies, or died, what happens then? There's no sustainable economic mechanism for continuing this brand. And Hinkle developed, in part, Hunter Thompson. But Hunter Thompson is so unique that he didn't really develop anyone after him, at least not personally. So once again, there's a gap. You don't see this gap in business, because all businesses have a succession plan. So when Warren Buffett goes away, someone else will replace him, and the goodwill that his businesses have built up will continue. People will still read the annual shareholder letter, even if Warren Buffett's name or Charlie Munger's name is not on it, because of the goodwill that those two men have built up. But the newspapers have lost goodwill in large part because they keep sort of blaming other people rather than having context. And what politicians were supposed to do is they were supposed to be able to create a situation where they spoke on behalf of all Americans, or all people in their country. And in doing so, gave a voice to current problems, but also prevented other media outlets from taking over their role. So if Angela Merkel is not speaking about climate change, but Volkswagen is, you can see how over time why the Volkswagen CEO would be more credible and therefore more listened to than the Chancellor. That hasn't happened in Germany. You can also see there's a bit of competition, right? Government regulators have to be careful as well, because there's, to the extent that corporations become too powerful, there's a tendency to overreact and overregulate, when what should have been happening all along is reasonable regulation that prevents an overreaction on either side. And I mention that because Volkswagen, I think, was involved in an emissions scandal, which came about because I believe a small group of researchers discovered a flaw. Not a big group of researchers, just a small group that was funded by, I don't know if it was an American government. I want to say the University of Virginia was involved, but don't hold me to that. But again, it was something that was funded by a government grant. And that's what gave people in that research group a bit of independence. That idea that you're part of this institution that's going to last forever, and therefore you're not beholden to a 4-year electorate. And Eisenhower knew that. Despite the fact that he was, subject to a 4-year election, he knew that he wasn't speaking only for people within that time. He was speaking on behalf, forever. Because the idea of a country, one of the reasons that countries can build up debt, because the banks assume that countries, unlike corporations, have infinite lifespans. So there's a sense that things are falling apart in the West. And part of that has to do with this idea that journalism has died. And it's died because it's not only it's failed to develop successors, but it's failed to come up with a business model that's sustainable. And in doing so, it's ceded its role to business, and comedy. And how do we get out of this funk? Other countries don't have this funk. Well, one of the reasons we got into this funk is because, remember, Eisenhower would never be caught dead advertising on behalf of somebody else. He wouldn't even appear in Life. He had problems appearing in Life magazine because his idea was that the government shouldn't be taking money from private organizations in order to advertise itself. It served the public, and therefore the work that it was doing on behalf of the public, wasn't advertising, right? There shouldn't be any advertising involved, simply because of integrity, of the idea of a conflict of interest. And so Eisenhower even had problems with something as innocuous as a Life magazine photo shoot and so on and so forth. He thought about the role of government, and I think he knew intuitively that it existed on its perch, on its high perch, because of integrity. That it could claim, because of its infinite lifespan, its assumed infinite lifespan, that it could claim that it above all else, was able to think long term, above all the other actors in the country. We don't have that in this country anymore. Amazon, Jeff Bezos, speaking of CEOs that are listened to, he has that, incredibly, more than the politicians do. So it's not difficult to understand that when the businessmen and the comedians take over your public square, within a society that is already fragmented, that there's going to be problems, despite how much the president wants to talk about unity and unifying the country. And the way to start would be to try to remember that Eisenhower had a mother that was apolitical as a matter of religion. And that had to have an impact on Eisenhower growing up. And the question is, how do we make politicians credible again? And it's not going to happen by recycling the same people from the same de facto ruling families. It's going to have to happen by finding or developing the next Eisenhower, somebody that understands what's going on. And you can't really do that without having a strong journalism sector, without having another Dan Rather, another Murrow, another Mapes. If you don't have those people around, the president or the next aspiring politician gets reduced to becoming either an actor or a de facto advertiser. And again, that's happening because no one's quite figured out a model for journalism that works. In fact, the CEO of Amazon, the one I just mentioned, bought the Washington Post, a newspaper that revealed corruption within Washington, D.C., along with the New York Times, with the Pentagon Papers. So what you see in this country is a shift towards money and debt above all things. And the reason, in part, that Eisenhower was able to be honest was because he relied on the people for his sustenance. In other words, the government relied on taxes and not so much on debt to sustain itself and grow. And during Eisenhower's time, or post-World War II, I should say, all the countries in the world owed the United States debt. They were in debt to the United States. So the United States was relying on other people's debt as well as taxes in order to create a society based on integrity. And if you think about it, if you take away taxes, you really bust the relationship between the taxpayer and the local politician, which then works its way all the way up to the national level in terms of having that breakage. And you also have to wonder if the Muslims were onto something when they came up with this idea of an economic system that prevented excessive debt. And of course, economically, that system hasn't been as successful post-World War II, simply because it's in the same way the Soviet Union was not as successful as the United States post-World War II, because if your competition has debt and spends it wisely, and you are more limited in your ability to grow GDP, you're going to bleed talent. Everything is at risk all the time for a 200% differential. in terms of an advantage. When you lose one person or you lose one piece of technology, it's always a 200% gap. That is, if you think about it, over time, insurmountable. Especially if the institutions that are benefiting from that advantage are able to create institutions that pass along, one of which is politics, that pass along that incremental knowledge that they've built up in a way that's sustainable. And that continues to allow them a leadership position that's based on building things, that's based on talent, that's based on improving everyone's situation. And what we have here with this president is simply giving away money. And there's a $1.9 trillion bill, it's called a stimulus package, that's being passed. It's being sold to the American public as, direct payments of $1,400 a year. A one-time direct payments of $1,400 on top of the $600 that was offered before. But what's really happening is a bailout of local and state governments. They receive $350 billion. That's separate from, I believe, another $60 to $80 billion of a pension fund that primarily deals with government and or union members. If you do the math, it comes out to about, with 10 million people, it comes out to be about $7,000 to $8,000 each. So have a quite small percentage of people within the working economy. So you've got all these essentially bailouts happening, and that's happening because when the politicians lose the interest of the people, because they don't have any credibility, you sink to the lowest common net denominator, which is money. In other words, you have to pay people to talk to you or to listen to you. And that's what's happened in this country. People think that this is a good thing, that we're expanding, that we're being compassionate. And on some level it is. But if the reason we got here in the first place, in other words, we shouldn't have ever put ourselves in a position where we needed a country that had to have an almost $2 trillion bailout in order to survive. And there's a sense, number one, that this can only continue with very low interest rates, which puts us at a disadvantage against any other country to the extent that other countries start to raise interest rates and thereby attract capital that would have otherwise gone to the United States. So there's a sense overall. Okay, see you. So there's a sense overall that the United States is becoming sort of lapsing into a political machine that happened in the old days, right? Where these bosses would pay people to vote multiple times. And there's nothing wrong with expanding a welfare state if you do it properly. Poor people, poverty kills, and poor people are an actual security threat because they can be recruited by a lot of other people. Most of the CIA assets that turned did so because of financial problems, as far as I know, as far as I've studied. And overall, when you look at all these issues, these bailouts are happening because the government has lost credibility. JFK didn't have to have a bailout. Eisenhower would have never needed a bailout to get attention. He had a strategy. He had a plan. And that plan back then not only made the United States great, it made the world great. And the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. Germany and Japan are now better off than the United States. The average German and the average Japanese citizen, is now better off than the average American citizen. That's a tragedy. It's not going to be fixed by giving money here and there to support the status quo, which includes the President of the United States bombing a Middle Eastern country within, I believe, 37 days in office. First 37 days in office. So where do we go from here? Well, hopefully, morality and integrity will play a part along with journalism and context.